Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my Form 5 ethics class. Today we're going to wrap up Question 6, Article 1 by taking a look at the replies to the objections. Let's get to it. The respondeo, even though it's laid out the framework for thinking about voluntariness as having that dual interiority of principle of action and knowledge of the end, doesn't really do anything to directly address the objection that the first objector brought up. Objects definitely move our appetites, and that seems to suggest that the actions don't really begin inside of us. They begin outside of us. So now is the time to tackle that head on. Unfortunately, the answer to this is a little difficult. My students every year struggle to wrap their heads around this a little bit. So we're going to talk through it, and we're definitely going to spend time in class together trying to talk it through. But you're going to need some good old-fashioned insight. You're just going to have to sit with this one for a little bit. We have a two-part answer. First, we've got a negative answer, a clarifying answer. And that's over here on the left. Starting with the lovely sentence, not every principle is a first principle. That's really the whole answer. What does that mean? We got to unpack that a little bit. Well, as we've emphasized, principle just means beginning. So that sentence can be parsed, not every beginning is a first beginning. In other words, we needn't be so absolutist about beginning as the first objection is trying to get us to be. Principles can be caused. All that Aquinas has committed to is that an action begins to exist inside of the agent, that it begins inside, not that it's uncaused. It can have a history. It can be moved by things. So as he says down at the bottom of the left side there, intrinsic doesn't mean first. It's not essential to the voluntary act that its intrinsic principle, or its beginning inside of a thing, be a first principle. If you push too hard on the idea of first principle, you basically end up saying that only God is a voluntary agent because he's the only uncaused cause. He's the only uncaused principle, or principle without any beginning in any sense. Beginnings can have beginnings, which is a strange thing to say. If we look on the right, Aquinas gives, I think, pretty interesting way to try to explain that. So the negative answer on the left, the positive answer on the right. So hopefully this example on the right, or this analogy on the right, can help you think through what we mean by those strange claims on the left. We can distinguish between something being a beginning, or being first, in one genus, a kind of movement or motion or change, and not first simply. So we could categorize movements into kinds of movements. Yeah? And you can have things be first in a genus. You can have something be first in one genus but not in another. Then he gives an example. It's a little bit of a strange one at first. Perhaps it's one of those odd Aristotelian cosmologies we turn our nose up at. Thus, in the genus of things subject to alteration, the first principle of alteration is a heavenly body, which is nevertheless not the first mover simply, but is moved locally by a higher mover. So, by genus of things subject to alteration, he means let's restrict our attention to things that are changing. And heavenly body just means the sun, something in the heavens. It doesn't mean an angel or God or anything like that. So what we have here is, if you look at things moving and changing here on Earth, the first principle of all of that change is the sun. That sounds pretty strange. But what if I change it to photosynthesis? In the genus of things subject to photosynthesis, the first principle of photosynthesis is the sun. That sounds okay to me. Photosynthesis is caused by the sun. The sun is not subject to the process of photosynthesis. It's the first thing in that genus. Okay, maybe we want to work out some more details, but that sounds about right. But when we say that the sun is the first principle of photosynthesis, we don't mean it's the first thing in the universe. We don't mean it's absolutely first. The sun is in fact moved. It's moved locally by a higher power. It's moving in space. It's local motion, positional change. All right, so Aquinas thought it was moving around the Earth, and we think it's not. We know it's not. We know it's moving in a different way, but that doesn't really matter. It is moving. All that matters is that it's moving. So it's first in one genus and a cause in that genus, photosynthesis. But when you look at a different genus of motion, it's not first. It's actually an effect. It's being moved by the mass of all the other stars in the galaxy, or however you want to do it, however you want to break that down. So very much the same way, when an object moves us, moves our appetite, that's one kind of movement. It's actually a different kind of movement than what begins to exist in us. It's not the case that when we are responding to the Reuben burger or the box of Krispy Kreme donuts or whatever, that we have one continuous motion beginning in an object outside of us and sort of rebounding out in a new direction from us. It's not like a collision problem. It's not a ricochet where we're just imparting force into another thing. Two different things are happening. So appetitive movement, the movement of our appetite, we have a power within us that is the first thing in that series of movements, but that principle is itself moved by something else, by the object, by the appetible object. And that's all he's saying here in the conclusion. The intrinsic principle of the voluntary act, the cognitive and appetitive power, it is first in one genus, the appetitive movement, what begins inside of us, but it is moved. It has a prehistory. It's an effect. It's caused by an extrinsic principle, according to another species of movement. And as soon as you can see that there are two different kinds of movement, then I think this answer gets a lot easier, and this problem gets a lot easier. And that's how we're ultimately going to relate the appetible object as an extrinsic principle of action with voluntary movement. Again, if you don't do it this way, you're going to end up trying to say that humans are all little miniature first movers running around the universe. And that is an actual way of thinking about will, but it's wrong. It's not correct. We really are changed. We need to not have so absolute a sense of what it means for our wills, our appetites, to be the beginning of something. And that's reply to 1. We'll spend more time on it. It's tricky. Let's go to 2. Reply to objection 2. How do objects move animals and therefore us? That's basically what objection 2 is all about. And the reply, I want to emphasize by looking at the last line, the reply does not add anything new in terms of the basic problem, how can objects move us and yet we still be voluntary? It's the exact same conclusion as reply to objection 1. Right? Just look at the last sentence on the bottom right. This is not contrary to the nature of voluntariness as stated above, for such movements caused by an extrinsic principle are of another genus of movement. We give the exact same answer. The reason we look at reply to objection 2 is for the paragraphs before, the sentences rather, before. We actually get a much closer look, which we'll need to elaborate on, at how objects move us. And not just us, but all animals. Because we haven't really gotten any clarity yet on the mechanism there, what the object is doing and how is it changing us. So that's what we'll do here. And this is going to help us build to our first diagram of the voluntary act. So first of all, in the most basic sense, animal senses are confronted with something sensible, which on being apprehended moves the appetite. We have an object and we have sensation. I've already mentioned sensitive knowledge in the previous video. Now we're going to talk more directly about that. We need to get a little clearer on that. Animals are defined by having sense powers, the sensitive cognition and sensitive appetite. So he gives the very simple example. A lion sees a stag and begins to move toward the stag, moves itself toward the stag. That's going to be the basic paradigm for all animal movement. Sensation is the way in which the object becomes present to the animal. That's how the object moves the appetite. What then follows is that other interior movement that begins inside the lion or the human, whatever kind of animal we're talking about. Object can be anything, really. this is a nice, easy example, but so can the form of sensing. It doesn't have to be seen. It can be heard or smelled. The animal or the object doesn't have to be present as a substance, like right there. It can be an object of memory or anticipation. So we'll get into those details later. We're not going to try to say everything possible about object and sensation right now. But this is the beginning of how we would think about the way objects move us, through sensation. The secondly, in the right side over here, that's starting to make both the object and the sensation a little more complicated. We don't only need the object to be a substance, it could also be something more indirect, like an environmental change that produces a change in the animal. Aquinas is a little wordy in how he says this, but a cold wind blows, or it gets very, very hot outside, as it is right now while I'm recording this video. That moves the animal's appetite to seek shade, or to burrow under the covers, or to get a drink of water, or whatever. We have different ways of responding to that, but the appetite is moved by the body itself changing, which is, I think, just a more complicated way of talking about sensation. It's another way of looking at this, at the same phenomenon of object and sense. And these are the two basic ways that animals are moved by objects, and therefore the two basic ways that we are moved by objects. However, we do want to integrate this with what I said in the Respondeo about rational powers. Aquinas has already dealt with rational powers earlier in the Summa, and that's one of the main weaknesses in the way that we try to do ethics this year. We don't go all the way back to the prima pars and work through the psychology that he covers there for humans, but we're going to pick it up along the way. Still, this should be familiar if you took my 9th grade class. We have a chart. It's a terrible chart. It's an ugly chart, but Abbey boys have been required to memorize it for as long as I've been teaching Aquinas here, so we'll duplicate it here. The OSIV chart. This is not a complete diagram of all of the things that are going on when an object moves us and we perform some sort of voluntary action as a result. This is only meant to diagram the things that are present in question 6, article 1. You can make much nicer charts that show all the relations a lot more clearly. There's a particular 6-block chart made by Father William Wallace that I like very much. We'll definitely use in class at a certain point. And we can make many others besides. But this one is essentially a quick and dirty diagram of what we've seen in the article so far. OSIV are, hopefully obviously, abbreviations for object, senses, intellect, and voluntas, which is the Latin word for will. And what we just looked at in the reply to Objection 2 was essentially the way object and O and S work, object and senses work together. Now let's try to fill out the diagram a little bit. At every level of knowledge, at the two basic levels of knowledge, animal or sense knowledge and rational knowledge or rational apprehension, we know things and we want things. So we have sense cognition or apprehension. These are the two very broad words that Aquinas uses for any level of knowing things, coming to know the universe, that you could say for humans or animals. So we have sense apprehension, and corresponding with that, we have a sense appetite. So the lion sees the stag, the lion wants the stag. The monkey sees the predator, the monkey flees from the predator. Those kinds of things. Seeks shelter, seeks safety, warns its friends, something like that. Or, in the case of a human, I see the Krispy Kreme donuts on the table, and I want the Krispy Kreme donuts on the table. Sense cognition, sense appetite. The diagram, the OSIV diagram, does not do a good job of showing that senses include both appetite and cognition, or appetite and apprehension. It's just sort of lumped together as S. It's one of the main advantages of using a different chart when we go down the road. But we also have, as humans, a further level of cognition and appetite. We have rational powers. That's the thing that sets us apart from animals. And this is what's going to get us to the level of proper ethics and proper voluntary action. Beyond sense knowledge, we have rational knowledge, the 3 acts of the intellect, understanding, judgment, reason. And we have an appetite that goes with it. The rational appetite, wanting those objects of intellection, is the voluntas. It's the will. It's where we get the word voluntary. It's built out of this word. Now, we can throw around a few medieval aphorisms here. One of them is that nothing is willed unless it is known. Appetite always follows cognition, or appetite always follows apprehension somehow. Hence the arrows over here on the left. Sense cognition pointing toward sense appetite. Rational cognition pointing toward rational appetite. But another really important medieval aphorism is there's nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. Part of the price of doing business as a rational animal is that our rational powers are at the mercy of our sense powers. It's only through the sense data and the senses experiencing the universe and all the O's of the universe that the intellect acquires the raw materials necessary for intellection. This is part of the reason we're the dumbest of the rational things. This is why angels are smarter than us. They're not limited in that regard. They just know things. We have to know through sense. So a complete pathway of thinking about what happens when we have a fully voluntary action, beyond just I see a donut and I want a donut, but a voluntary, I see injustice and I want justice to be done. I see a friend and I love them, that sort of thing. For those kinds of things, we have an object which is presented to our senses, and that sense experience in turn is worked on by the intellect, which forms some sort of judgment about the thing as either good or bad, and we have an appetite that pursues that object. We go get it or make it or do it. We're not really drawing all of that here. Obviously, we've only really drawn the in path, the way the object ultimately moves the will. The will is moved by the object as it exists in the intellect. The will is really moved by the intellect itself, the object as it exists there. And we could draw a return path of what a voluntary act would look like, but that's actually going to come down the road. That's going to be our practical reason unit in about a month. What we're going to do with this diagram for the next several weeks, month or so, for the rest of question 6 is stress test it. We want to look at these parts and we want to look at where it breaks, breaking the connections at any of these points. How can we short circuit things? How can we prevent voluntary action? How can we make it so that we never really get a properly voluntary act? That's what all the remaining articles are about. And we'll be refining this very, admittedly, very crude model for the rest of the semester. So that's reply to objection 2. And that just leaves reply to objection 3. And my question here is there anything left to say? Because once we look at this close up, it turns out there's actually not much to say here at all. You already know all of this. First of all, because a lot of it has already been said in reply to objection 1 and 2. Remember that the objection was, how can actions come from within us if without God we can do nothing? And in that introductory video on the objections, I related this to the first mover argument. If God is the first mover of the will, then how are we doing anything? Well, now we're going to look at it. And it turns out the answer is pretty simple. God does move humans to act. And you should recognize the first two, because we just talked about them in reply to objection 2. God creates appetible objects. He creates the universe. And he makes all these things that are appetible, or anti-appetible, or fugible. And he could create in a miracle as well, right? He could do something miraculous to propose some new object to the senses. God also affects changes in the body in that sense of indirect environmental changes. God is not just creating objects, but he's sustaining them in being, and he's organizing the way they interact with each other. He's designed the whole universe. You can think about this as providence. Right? Indirectly, there's all sorts of ways he's changing us and affecting us. He's turned up the thermostat on the world, at least where I live right now. It's quite warm out. So both of those are just sort of the normal creation, providence type things that we've talked about before in the last reply, but also in the previous years that I've taught you. The third way God moves us is as the first mover. And he doubles down on this. Every movement, either of the will or of nature, proceeds from God as the first mover. That's the point of the first mover argument. The act of the will, of the voluntas is not an exception to the first mover argument. There are no exceptions to the first mover argument. So when you're first learning the first way in ninth grade or whenever you learn it, you're trying to show that any changing thing in the universe can be traced back to God as the first mover of that change. Well, you normally pick something stupid like sliding a pencil across a desk or spinning something around or whatever. That's just to keep things simple. Every single change, every single action in the universe works this way, and the act of the will is no exception. God is the first mover of every act of the will. Well, as we've seen before, although we have glossed over the details, it's not incompatible with natural movement that it be from God as the first mover and that nature is an instrument of God moving it. Same with the voluntary movement. It's not contrary to the essence of a voluntary act that it proceed from God. Just because God is the first mover of the pen sliding across the desk doesn't mean the pen isn't sliding across the desk. It's not an illusion. And just because God is the first mover of the act of the will doesn't mean the act of the will isn't real. It still really is a thing that begins inside of us according to a principle of knowledge. It really does that. It does that because God is the first mover of it. What he does here is he really tightly binds natural movement with voluntary movement. And this is very important for a lot of the things he's going to do down the road. The study of natural movement is physics, and the study of voluntary movement is ethics. And so his grounding of his move of I have a physics argument, so I'm going to transport that to an ethics context is based here, because the voluntary is just a special subset of the natural. So we don't have a new insight into the way the voluntary act proceeds from God as the first mover, but is still free, unless you go back to Reply to Objection 1. Reply to Objection 1 has actually already started to answer this in a principled way that we haven't seen before. And I don't want to say too much about that in the video here, because that's actually one of the main questions that I have for my students. This is one of the main things I expect them to talk about and write about. So I'm going to leave that there as a little bit of an open-ended puzzle. But it's really important to be able to see how the answer to Objection 1, 2, and 3 is all in some sense the same. But then also to see how each of them will go off into a different direction in the future. We're going to be coming back to Article 1 and the basic ideas in it for a long, long time. It's going to be a midterm exam question, and indeed it can plausibly be a final exam question. We're just going to take a better and better look at all of these ideas over and over and over again. And that, my friends, is the entirety of Question 6, Article 1. Obviously, we went through it pretty slowly compared to what I expect us to be able to do as we go forward, but we needed to set the tone and show you all the things that you need to be looking at. The next video series, we're going to move on with the next several articles in Question 6, and we'll move faster, and I will focus on fewer things in each article. But that's it. We've conquered our first article. Good work. If you have any questions about this article, or indeed anything in ethics, or anything at all, you know how to reach me. Good luck studying, and I hope to see you soon in class.